Velina, aloha, and aloha to the ancestors of the Tongva people upon whose lands we gather today. As an uninvited guest to these territories, I pray that my words honor the sovereignty of the land and her people, including past, present, and future generations. Mahalo to Patrick and to Chase and the team for their invitation to be here today and for the coordination and hospitality we've been shown. So mahalo. As was noted in my introduction, so on the program, my affiliation is with the University of Hawaii at Manoa, but as my introduction today demonstrates, I've since moved from the University of Hawaii at Manoa to the University of Utah. And it's in Utah that I was raised and that I will be speaking about today. So, and I also wanted to note that I come to this conference as an American Studies and Indigenous Studies scholar who happened to write a book about the LDS Church. When I accepted the invitation to speak at this conference, I was planning to present from my book, which focused on how the LDS Church came to be in Hawaii and how Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders engaged with the church and the gospel. However, a discussion I had with my sister, my older sister, changed my plans and my thinking. So last month, I was invited to be a discussant on a panel after a screening of the documentary Ever the Land, a story of the 150-year battle between the Tūhoe iwi in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and the British Crown for rightful control over their lands. The film documents the resolution of this fight that culminated in the Crown apologizing for taking their lands, paying restitution for losses accrued from that theft, and the construction of a community center that symbolizes a new beginning for this iwi. The film powerfully depicts the economic, spiritual, and physical toll colonization has had on the Tūhoe community. Through breach of treaty, the Crown took control of their sacred mountain and turned it into a nature reserve for hikers. While under Crown control, the Tūhoe had no say in what happened to or on their sacred lands. What comes through quite vividly is how dispossession feels and what it does to indigenous peoples and to their land. The filmmaker was able to capture the despair of dispossession, as well as the hope that comes from the renewal of the Tūhoe sacred and familial relationship, their ability to care for their mountain again, in their own way. After the film, we had a panel discussion after the film, and a representative from the Ute Nation talked about his people's struggle to retain control of what little lands and waters they have left. And then two Maori panelists spoke about the struggles their iwi face trying to get the Crown to honor treaty. One uncle made what I consider to be a very important point, which is Indigenous people cannot wait for the Crown to give them back their land. Their language, their culture, their history, their land, their culture, their language, their history. It is our responsibility to restore these things in our communities and to make sure future generations are raised knowing who they are. For me, Uncle gets to the point, and it is a point that I've heard repeated many times these last few months as we, the faculty who are involved in the Pacific Island Studies Initiative at the University of Utah, have heard as we host various events in the Pacific Islander community in Salt Lake City. What parents are asking us is, how do we maintain our identities as Maori, as Kanaka Oiwi, as Tongans and Samoans while living in Utah? My preliminary answer was that we do that by learning and speaking our languages, learning and commemorating our living histories, practicing our ceremonies, and remembering how to be in a reciprocal relationship with land. And since all of this is being done while living in Utah, on the lands of other indigenous peoples, we must also become allies in their work to restore their peoplehood. If we do not, then we contribute to continued dispossession, erasure, oppression of other indigenous peoples. To illuminate my point, I talked about Iosepa. Iosepa is a former Polynesian Mormon settlement located about 70 miles southeast of Salt Lake City in a region called Skull Valley, which isn't its native name. In the Shoshone language, it actually has many different names, and many of them are associated with water because of the freshwater springs that are there, which explains why it was an important site for the Goshute peoples. So the settlement was established by Joseph F. Smith for Native Hawaiian saints who started immigrating to Utah in the 1880s. The city of Iosepa was named for Joseph F. Smith, and it existed from 1889 until 1917, when it was closed and the Polynesian saints were forced to return to Hawaii, where the Laie Temple was under construction and getting ready to be built. Every Memorial Day weekend since the late 1970s, Polynesian Mormons have made the trek to Iosepa to commemorate these first Polynesian pioneers, as they're called. Today, the Iosepa Association hosts the annual Iosepa Festival on Saturday and Sundays. All are welcome. It is a blast. While the Iosepa Festival is organized to remember the faith and perseverance of these saints, what we do not commemorate or acknowledge is that these lands that we claim as ours is in fact the territory of the Skull Valley Goshute tribe. I ask the audience to consider Iosepa not from the lens that privileges the Mormon aspects of this history, but to see it from a uniquely indigenous vantage point. Through an indigenous lens, what we would see is a place where the bones of Polynesian ancestors have perhaps mingled with the bones of Goshute ancestors. And when we see this perspective, and when seen from this perspective, we're forced to acknowledge that this is not our land, but for the fact that our ancestors are buried here, we would have no kuleana to it, no responsibilities to it. Currently, my brother-in-law serves as president of the Iosepa Association, and my sister also serves on the board. After the film and discussion, she came up to me afterwards and asked, "So does this mean we should invite the Goshute leader to join us for the ceremony, the opening ceremonies? And should we also invite the community members to come as well?" And I unequivocally replied that we should, because, and I can be a little sassy, because when we, as uninvited guests, have a party, the least we could do is invite those whose homeland we're partying on. Okay, that's me being sassy. So my comments today take up the concerns of the Pacific Islander parents who want to know how to remain indigenous while living in diaspora by offering decolonization and indigenous resurgence as theoretical and ethical frameworks of praxis, which I consider to be key for thinking about the political relationship between the global and the local in settler colonial contexts. Specifically, my remarks are focused on the question of what might moving toward global Mormon studies mean for indigenous peoples. I want to note that my work in thinking about this question is limited to indigenous peoples whose lands are occupied by settler colonial states such as the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. It is not a framework that is transferable to all colonial contexts, but very particular. What does moving toward global Mormon studies entail for us as scholars, for the field, and for indigenous peoples? These questions in the case of Iosepa remind us that the global is always lived at the local, at the level of the local. So we don't have to leave the geopolitical boundaries of the United States to engage the global. Rather, Hawaiian and Polynesian saints' migration to Utah, which began in the 1880s and continues today, remind us that Mormonism, again, has been global for a really long time and has already reshaped people and places in empowering and oppressive ways. So I want to begin by thinking about the global through the lens of globalization. As my colleague Jeff Korntassel and I have written elsewhere, globalization can be characterized in lots of different ways, and we frame it in the context of 4 intellectual cul-de-sacs that impede greater understanding of the complexities of globalizing forces. These are globalization as internationalization, globalization as liberalization, globalization as universalization, and globalization as westernization. If the goal is to move Mormon studies towards one or all of these notions of the global, then I am not convinced the move will be beneficial for indigenous peoples. Indeed, globalization in all of these 4 forms are not new, and one could argue that as a global religion, Mormonism has been global since it started, sending missionaries out into the world, right? And so we can think about these dimensions in Mormonism and Mormon studies. But what I want to emphasize is that given that these globalizing forces are not new phenomenon for indigenous peoples, it's important to see the global then as an extension and intensification of forces of colonialism. Consequently, for indigenous peoples, there's a very real downside to a global Mormon studies that does not contend with the correlative move toward material decolonization. To be sure, while the global in the conference title may in fact signal an attempt to disrupt existing hierarchies and power dynamics within the field, without an equally robust discussion of decolonization, which requires a recognition of what indigenous peoples seek and acting upon that knowledge, then the result will be more of the same. I contend that indigenous peoples simultaneously seek recovery from ongoing colonial violence, as well as recovery of land and water-based cultural practices. Corntassel and I call this a doctrine of recovery, which espouses, quote, both recovery of land, culture, and community in tandem with recovery from the trauma of ongoing colonization. Strategies of recovery form the basis for current and future indigenous movements and practices and represent an indigenous rejection of the doctrine of discovery, end quote. So a rejection of the doctrine of discovery is important for moving a global decolonized Mormon studies forward because it requires that we acknowledge that notions of promised lands, Zion, and other Mormon pioneer discourses, and even the very term pioneer, are part of a genealogy that grows out of American nationalist discourses of manifest destiny, which has its origins in and gets its legitimacy from the doctrine of discovery from the 15th century. A key part of an indigenous doctrine of recovery is representing indigenous identities and communities on our own terms. It is an approach that emphasizes indigenous notions of connectivity that coalesce around resurgence, which entails the regeneration of our peoplehood. In contrast to definitions of indigenous that emphasize indigenous communities and peoples and nations as subordinate to or marginalized within nation states, our approach builds on this peoplehood idea. And the four interlocking factors of this peoplehood framework are language, sacred living histories, ceremonial cycles, and homelands, and that these are the foundations for the persistence and political, economic, cultural, and social expression of peoplehood. And we also argue that this expression of peoplehood requires constant renewal through everyday acts, which we argue forms the basis for indigenous resurgence. I also suggest that indigenous resurgence is, again, incomplete without decolonization. When I title the aim of this paper as contributing to decolonization, what I'm speaking to is a commitment to the return of indigenous lands to indigenous peoples and the removal of the kinds of institutions and now corporations that occupy and abuse indigenous homelands. To bring about this alternative future, because it is an alternative one, it's not the one we're heading towards, a process of decolonization must work at all levels that imperialism and colonialism has operated. As education scholars Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang contend, quote, when we write about decolonization, we are not offering it as a metaphor. It is not an approximation of other experiences of oppression. Decolonization is not a swappable term for other things we might want to do to improve our societies and schools. Decolonization doesn't have a synonym, end quote. So decolonization isn't a metaphor. It is a set of practices and principles that lead or contribute to indigenous self-determination of their lands, people, practices, our present, our past, and our futures. It is also important to keep in mind that decolonization contributes to anti-racist and anti-heteronormative patriarchal movements. However, anti-racism and feminist critiques of heteronormativity don't always lead to decolonization. So there is a kind of mismatch there. As Tuck and Yang write, quote, in our view, decolonization in the settler colonial context must involve the repatriation of land simultaneous to the recognition of how land and relations to land have already been differently understood and enacted. That is, all of the land, not just symbolically. That is precisely why decolonization is necessarily unsettling, especially across lines of solidarity. Settler colonialism and its decolonization implicates and unsettles everyone, end quote. So when I call for decolonize, that's so out of time. For decolonized Mormon studies, and when I say to my sister, yes, the Go Shoot should be involved in everything we do at Iosepa, I'm asking that we rethink everything we think we know about Mormonism and Mormons' relationship to Utah, including, but not limited to, the narratives, commemorations, pageants, and place names that reinforce a Mormon relationship to these indigenous lands. Okay, then I go into this whole long thing about how everyday acts of resurgence, like it's the stuff that we do every day on a regular basis that's ritualized, perhaps annually or cyclically, that bring about this resurgence. And so the story of Iosepa is instructive because on one level, the events on Saturday could easily be described as everyday acts of resurgence. The main events of the festival happen on Saturday, but families who plan to camp the entire weekend start coming and setting up, these little villages on Thursday. So Saturday begins with a Hawaiian sun rising chant and a Mormon prayer, followed by a flag-raising ceremony conducted by Polynesian members of the U.S. military, who solemnly raise the national flags of all of the Polynesian nations. These three events, Hawaiian Oli, Mormon prayer, and recognition of Polynesian nationalism, really, I think, symbolize the kinds of complexities of what is commemorated and remembered and performed at this event. But then there's also a pretty obvious omission there. So during the day, starting at about 11 o'clock, there's at 10 o'clock in the morning, there's informational presentations, there's Hawaiian language lessons, there are musical and dance performances, and there's crafts, all kinds of events going on during the day, and the event ends with a potluck luau feast where the Iosepa Association provides the pork and the beef and sweet potatoes, and they cook it in the imu. They start that off first thing in the morning, and then they open it up, and everybody gets to eat. For those who are going to stay overnight or through the evening, as the sun goes down, the fire knife dancers come out and perform as the DJ gets ready for a dance, which is super hella fun. On Sunday morning, the large pavilion is then transformed again from dance club to chapel in preparation for LDS church services, in which the congregation is invited to publicly share their testimony of the truthfulness of the gospel and reflections about Iosepa. When I asked my dad why he and my mom took our family to Iosepa every year, he replied, "Kuleana." He and Mom wanted to get together with friends and do something Hawaiian, with Hawaiians and for Hawaiians. I ask, what do you mean by doing things for Hawaiians? He responds, "We wanted to take care of them." By them, he means the Hawaiians who are buried in the cemetery and whose spirits still reside in the desert. So each year we would pile into, and my family's been going to Iosepa since we moved to Salt Lake City area in 1976. I don't think they've ever missed someone from our family's always been there. So every Memorial weekend, we would pile into the station wagon, loaded down with food, gardening tools, mosquito repellent, and kids, to spend Memorial Day cleaning the cemetery with my dad and his friends and their families. With pride, Dad remembers, quote, "When we were done, the place looked really nice," end quote. Kuleana, a key theme in this rationale for the annual trip to Iosepa, embodies a cultural value of responsibilities that is perpetuated at the festival. Indeed, we can interpret Kuleana as a form of indigenous resurgence. This Kuleana takes material form when we clean the graves, spend time at the site, and talk story. These collective actions are forms of caring for our iwi kupuna, our ancestors' bones. And within a Hawaiian worldview, both the kula iwi, the place where those bones are buried, and the bones themselves are sacred, and it is our collective responsibility to care for them. As Aikau and Tengan describe it, the burial of iwi is a reflection of a broader Hawaiian cosmology and genealogy of the interdependent relationships between the iwi, the bones, the kula iwi, the land, and the living, kanaka. The burial of Iwi, they explain, results in the physical growth of plants and the spiritual growth of mana, spiritual power. The living descendants feed off the foods of the land and are nourished spiritually by the knowledge that the Iwi kupuna are well cared for in their rightful place, the land. The Iosepa festival is a community that has been built around the kula iwi that nourishes and sustains the people who gather there. But Aikau and Tengan are describing cultural practices and understandings that take place in Hawaii, not Utah. Caring for iwi kupuna at Iosepa is an act that relies on a different kind of framework, one that I think requires us to understand indigeneity in a diasporic context. And herein lies the tension at the center of where I began my remarks. The celebration of our Polynesian Mormon identities and the acts of resurgence that are renewed each year at Iosepa are predicated upon a forgetting. On the one hand, so caring for iwi kupuna at Iosepa is an act that performs indigenous renewal. It reflects a Hawaiian sensibility of the cycle of life and the interdependence among Kanaka, Aina, and Mana. And on the other, even as the act of caring for our iwi kupuna can be seen as an act of renewal for us, it is predicated upon the continued erasure of the Skull Valley Goshutes' relationship to that same land, their land. In making an indigenous claim to land in Utah, even when done within an indigenous framework of Kuleana and Malama of the iwi, we are still enacting a forgetting of the prior indigenous relationship to the same land. To be sure, since the cemetery is recognized by the state, rights to bury the dead at Iosepa are sanctioned by law. But are they by culture? However, when we gather at Iosepa and only commemorate those parts of our history that stress a Mormon Polynesian connection and make claims to land based on this one historical reality without also accounting for a prior and much older historical reality, then we have moved from practicing indigenous resurgence to reproducing settler colonial logics of elimination. So when I say to my sister, yes, let's invite the Goshute, we begin the unsettling process of decolonizing our relationships to this sacred place. When we recognize how the mana of our ancestors now mingles with the mana of the ancestors of the Goshute, we are living indigenous resurgence. A decolonial global Mormon studies means having the courage and imagination to envision life beyond settler colonial logics of elimination in order to move toward resurgence and freedom for all of us, not just some of us. Mahalo and aloha aina.